Welcome, Megan, and I'd like to introduce you.
Thanks. Thanks, Carol.
I'm particularly impressed by that.
Thanks. Thanks. I had edited my bio, so thanks for keeping that in. A proud Gold Award winner. Good morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here today to introduce Carol Bellamy. I'm just thrilled. It's truly an honor for me to introduce her. She, to me, is a national treasure. She recently completed her mandate as the chair of the governing board of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund. She was previously a member of the New York State Senate, president of the New York City Council, director of the United States Peace Corps, executive director of the United Nations Children's Fund, also known as UNICEF, and chair of the board of the directors of the Global Partnership for Education. Ms. Bellamy has worked in the private sector at Morgan Stanley, in Cravath, Swaine, and more. She is also an emeritus member of the American University of Beirut Board of Trustees and is a former fellow of the Harvard Institute of Politics. She has been awarded the Legion of Honor by the government of France and the Order of the Rising Sun in Japan. It's truly an honor. Carol's going to provide some remarks, and then we're going to have an exchange. I think this is going to work.
No, that one I think is not on.
I think this one will work then.
So I don't know which one I'm using. Am I using this one?
This one? Yeah.
Oh, alrighty. Welcome to a weekend in New York. If you're a New Yorker, you'll know that for the last 47 weekends, we have not had any sun. And so, it's the way it is. Good thing you got to see something yesterday. So I will offer a few remarks, hopefully not too long, and then we'll have a chat. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about the UN and UN institutions. I don't mean to limit international institutions just to the UN, but I'm going to use those as a focus point. So 2 weeks ago, the UN General Assembly met here in New York. For the insiders, we call it UNGA. For New Yorkers, we call it Really Bad Traffic Week, as contrasted with Bad Traffic Week, which is the rest of the year. It was actually the largest gathering of world leaders at the UN headquarters since the COVID-19 pandemic, with almost 90 heads of state showing up. As an aside, I would mention that of the 90, only 21 were women. Last year, at least 22 women came, so we continue in this world to go in the wrong direction. They had a very long to-do list, as you can tell from the title, and I'm going to now give you the title. Quote, "Rebuilding Trust and Reigniting Global Solidarity, Accelerating Action on the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals Towards Peace, Prosperity, Progress, and Sustainability for All." Unquote. So that was the agenda. To summarize that agenda, let me say, in other words, we need urgent action by everyone, on everything, everywhere, and we need it right now. That was the agenda. So I want to take stock of where we are today, particularly with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. And Megan said some of you may not know what the SDGs are. I will not go into great detail, but they are basically global goals agreed upon by virtually every head of state a couple of years ago, focused on such simple things as eradicating poverty, feeding people, keeping children healthy, and other related types of things. But they are critically important, and they are the goals that have been agreed upon by the leaders of the world community. We're at the halfway point toward trying to achieve these goals. The 2030 year was given as the deadline to achieve the SDGs, as they are called. We have 7 years to go, and we are in very deep trouble. Progress toward the SDGs came to a complete halt as a result of the pandemic, as you might expect. So the impact of COVID-19, combined with climate change and conflict, and I don't limit the conflict just to Ukraine, triggered the 3 C's crisis. You throw in now the cost of living crisis, and we now have 4 C's to deal with. But progress toward the SDGs even then was too slow and falling back long before the pandemic, before all these conflicts, before soaring food prices. We were already quite off track. According to the latest UN report on progress, of the 36 targets reviewed, we are expected to reach only 2 by 2030, the end date. One is increased access to mobile networks, and the other increased use of the internet. I'm not sure either of those are wonderful to achieve. Progress on 8 other targets is going in the wrong direction. Half of these relate to our climate and environment, removing fossil fuel subsidies, reducing emissions, protecting fish stocks, and preventing the extinction of species. And there has been little or no progress on 12 other targets, and they include some of the biggest big-ticket items, such as I mentioned before, eradicating extreme poverty, ending the preventable deaths of children under the age of 5, and making sure that every child has at least a primary education. For the 14 other targets reviewed by the UN, the verdict is quite mixed. So this UN report is quite blunt. Without an urgent course correction to accelerate progress, we face the risks of longer and more intense periods of crisis and uncertainty triggered by and reinforcing poverty, inequality, hunger, disease, conflict, and disaster. I'm trying to cheer you up this morning. The point is, we have to do better. So now to the international institutions. Where are the international institutions in all of this? And again, I don't limit the international institutions to the UN, but for purposes of not boring you to death for hours, I'm going to concentrate on international institutions at this point. I think basically they are doing their best in the world that the UN Secretary General has described, and I'll use his word, as unhinged. But they are, in my view, facing unprecedented challenges. There is no global consensus, there are funding pressures, and there's an erosion of trust, just to name 3. For example, this year's UNGA was going to focus on the long-term future of the United Nations. That's what was first announced. That was until a coalition of more than 130 developing countries called instead just for, not, I shouldn't say just for, but called for a laser-sharp focus on the SDGs. They argued that the UN needed to double down on these goals before moving on to any kind of long-term planning. But even then, it was difficult to get agreement on how to accelerate progress toward the goals. There was agreement on a declaration, but that declaration just welcomed plans for development stimulus, and then asked for a great deal of money, $500 billion each year to tackle the goals. Of course, as with most UN declarations, it was very vague in details, with member states agreeing to advance the proposal in, and this is great UN language, a timely manner. Again, and at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, we just have 7 years left to go to reach the SDGs. What does timely manner mean here when the deadline is almost on top of us? The declaration also called for an overhaul of the international financial institutions to expand debt relief and mobilize more money. Of course, that was not agreed upon by all. The United States and a small group of other rich nations insisted that the reform of these institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF, was a matter for the institutions themselves, not for the United Nations. At the same time, then, there were calls from countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to shift the international debate on the multilateral financing of development from Washington, where the United States and other high-income countries hold sway, to the UN, where every country has an equal vote. Again, we do not have global consensus. So this declaration, fuzzy as it was, made it through, just about, but the difficulties in getting it across the line illustrate the chronic lack of global consensus, as I've said. It also reflects the persistent challenge of raising funds. Appeals coordinated by the United Nations reached an all-time high in 2021, with more than $38 billion requested for 48 appeals, almost $8 billion more than was requested in 2019. That was the amount requested. By the end of the last year, these appeals had received less than $17 billion, just 56% of the funding that they needed. And there's a trend here. Over the past 10 years, the bigger the appeal, the bigger the funding gaps. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, we are seeing an erosion in trust of international institutions, including certainly the UN and its agencies. What happens when we lose faith in our institutions, national or global? We look elsewhere. And when our institutions fail, as all institutions do to some degree, there's no shortage of people ready to step in. And there's no guarantee that they'll be the good guys. In the absence of safe pathways for refugees, for example, we have traffickers. In the absence of strong child protection in every country, we have predators and those who profit from child exploitation. And in the absence of tolerant, inclusive, prosperous societies, we have populist politicians offering easy answers and very often someone else to blame. Now, of course, our international institutions should be questioned, given the world's failure to eradicate poverty or to get every child into school or to build societies that are fair and just. They are not certainly immune to or insulated from the growing polarization of our world. But whatever their imperfections, it's hard to see how progress can be restored or maintained, let alone accelerated, if they were not there. So let me offer a few examples. Look at health. We need the World Health Organization. If it isn't there, what will we do when the next global pandemic hits? As it surely will. It's clear we can't leave this to individual countries. Only 13 heads of state showed up at the UNGA high-level meeting on pandemic prevention. 13. And it's not as if the COVID-19 pandemic is ancient history. Meanwhile, 4.5 billion people were not covered by basic health services in 2021, more than half of the population of the entire planet. We need the World Food Program, WFP. Earlier this year, I worked with a team at the Rockefeller Foundation to explore where we stand on food security. It is not good. We now have the largest appeals for humanitarian food aid, the largest funding gaps in history, and the largest numbers of people who are food insecure. And even the funding gaps are unfair, with the most vulnerable people in the countries that are in the deepest crisis receiving a dwindling share of food aid dollars. To put it mildly, but clearly, as things stand, more people will go to bed hungry in 2030 than tonight. We need the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. And I'm not just saying that because it's my favorite UN organization and because I was its executive director. I'm saying it because its mandate is clear: to protect the rights of every child, everywhere, and especially those who are the most disadvantaged. Time and again, we see the same kids falling through cracks: the poorest, those with disabilities, the millions who are on the move or caught up in wars, those who live in remote areas, and still and continually, unfortunately, very often girls. UNICEF has been there for them for more than 75 years. It has helped to protect billions of children from disease. It's gotten billions into schools, provided billions with decent nutrition. Today, it often works behind the scenes to help government protect children who, without extra support, will be left behind, even in countries that can well afford to immunize and educate every child. We need the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, as we can see only too clearly on our news channels. More than 108 million people were forcibly uprooted from their homes by the end of last year. More than half of them from just 3 countries: Afghanistan, Syria, and of course, Ukraine. The needs are enormous and growing. But within just 72 hours, UNHCR can mobilize enough supplies for 1 million people, and it can get its experts on the ground to protect those who are often running for their lives. Over the past 10 years, it has helped around 1 million people rebuild their lives in new countries. And it has worked with more than 100 countries to make sure that refugees are protected under the law. We need UN Women, given the pushback against women's rights that we're seeing in country after country, and the venom so often aimed at women in public life. And we need the UN to lead on the environment, given the lack of progress on key goals in this area, and a persistent failure to grasp one simple fact. Climate change doesn't do borders. It demands a global approach. So I would argue, make no mistake, if our international institutions, and in this case particularly the UN and its agencies, were dismantled next Monday, we would have to start putting them back together again next Tuesday. We would have no other option. We live in a global climate that increasingly seems to relish conflict and dispute, from the algorithms that reward outrage on social media to the leaders who wage wars. It is a world where rational debate and discussion is starting to seem somehow quaint and old-fashioned. Our international institutions are precious because they still bring people together around common cause. They are places where debate, however bumpy and fractious, continues to thrive. This is where the world meets to conduct its business. That being said, it cannot be business as usual. The international institutions need to, as the title of the recent UNGA stressed, rebuild trust. How are they going to do that? Well, it would help if they had the funding that they need for a start, and it would help if evidence-based, proven approaches to poverty, food insecurity, conflict resolution, and a mass of other challenges was taken to scale. But above all, we need to get serious about where we are going and how we are going to get there. This means rowing our global boat in the same direction and with far greater energy. Because if we don't, we risk being swept away by the current. It also means nothing short of transformation, strategic, interconnected, systemic transformation. Today's crises are not independent. They are not standalone events. They are all intertwined and they fuel and intensify each other. But it is their very interconnectedness that I, at least hope, will be their downfall. We can exploit the links across poverty, climate-related disasters, gender inequality, lack of education, loss of natural resources, and more, and we can turn them to our advantage, with wins in each area spilling over onto wins elsewhere. The most recent UN report on progress toward the global goals calls for the development of a transformational framework for accelerated action by 2024. This would combine local action with international cooperation, cooperation that will demand even greater action by our international institutions. I think this is a plan that will work, and it is long overdue. Transformation is, in my view, possible, and I hope it's inevitable. We don't have to look far to see what can be achieved when the world rallies around a common cause. Just 2 years ago, we came together as one to hold the line against COVID-19. And the vaccines that reached billions of people are thought to have saved 20 million lives in the first year of the rollout. So it can't be beyond us to come together again and deliver these global sustainable development goals. It would enrich our lives and our societies. It would help our communities heal and recover in the wake of crisis. It would also make them stronger and better able to deal with whatever comes their way in the future, from floods to earthquakes, and from economic downturns to the politics of division. In sum, there is simply no excuse not to do it. So finally, my message to our international institutions and to the governments that fund them, to quote both the Secretary General of the United Nations and Nike, there is no plan B, just do it. Thank you very much. Boop, boopity, bop, bop. Do we do this here? I'm going to have to go get that thing to get up here. Sorry. Oops. Let's see what I can do here.
Can you help me?
I'll get it. Sorry. When you get old, things wear out, but the good news is you can get new ones. So I'm getting a new hip in a couple of weeks. So, excuse me.
All ready to go? Thanks. All right. Thanks, Carol. Wow, there's so much to respond to there. I'm just going to launch into the first question. This year's UNGA, notably only one of the 5 permanent leaders, permanent 5 of the Security Council, excuse me, was present, President Biden. This lack of participation has raised concerns about the diminishing influence of the UN and its ability to be an effective convener. What are your thoughts on the absence of P5 leadership? Do you envision a path forward for effective global cooperation?
I worry about global cooperation right now. I also, I'm somewhat not worried so much that only one of the P5 showed up, because what's wrong with the UN, if there's something wrong with the UN, is the P5. I mean, the Security Council, which is totally outdated. I mean, I mentioned some of the organizations of the UN, which I would argue need to make sure they keep reforming themselves, but are needed. But the Security Council is, I don't see it changing, unfortunately, but I think the Security Council is clearly a relic of the past. And so to put so much attention into the fact that 4 of the 5 permanent members didn't show up, it just is to give more credibility to them than it seems to me one should. Now, that doesn't take away from the importance of China, certainly right now, and the role that Russia is playing. But I think we need to continue to try and build a community across nations and not simply continue to rely on the P5 because they are non-functioning at this point.
I mean, in some ways, their absence, I think, strengthens the argument that the P5 needs to be reformed.
Well, the Security Council certainly needs to be reformed. I don't see it happening, unfortunately. I mean, there have been many different kinds of proposals. Nothing is impossible. I just don't see it happening at this point because they have the veto power, unfortunately. But I hope one will continue to do that. That's why I think some of the other both UN entities and then, you know, non-state entities as well need to continue to play a role to try and bring about some global consensus in different areas. I think if we didn't have the UN, we'd have to, it's the same as the League of Nations. If we didn't have the UN, we'd have to create it again, but that doesn't mean it should be the only actor.
Right. You noted an erosion of trust in international organizations as well as the gap to collectively achieve the SDGs. Given the diverse backgrounds of young leaders in this room, what can we do in our roles in the private sector and philanthropy and media to get the SDGs to the finish line and beyond?
Well, I know I've engaged in UN gobbledygook by mentioning the SDGs, so I don't think that one has to get up each morning and think, what shall I do about the SDGs? But I think we all need to think about what contribution we can make wherever it is to better societies. So what, I mean, having spent time both in the public and the private sector, I think, you know, whatever one is engaged in as a vocation, that it's always good to have at least a bit of an avocation. And so make choices about where to also devote some of your time other than your vocation. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and influence whatever your vocation is as well. And whatever it is of particular interest to you. I mean, I think the world needs, and I actually believe the young leaders are, but global citizens. And in my mind, global citizens are not, the measure of a global citizen is not the number of stamps in your passport. You can be a global citizen in your own community, working in a local food bank or your local church or school or, you know, a children's center, whatever, or working for the Girl Scouts, as the case may be, since I was a Girl Scout too. I don't think I was a good Girl Scout, but I was a Girl Scout.
I'm sure you were.
But I mean, so to me, a global citizen is an open mind of recognizing the value of diversity and how much we benefit from engaging with others with whom we may agree or disagree, frankly. I think it's more important sometimes to also make sure you're engaging with some people that you may disagree, because it opens your mind. So I think everybody has enough time in their life, no matter how busy they are and how important they are and how they're moving up the ladder for success, to also devote a little bit of time to some goals that might make things just a little bit better. Not that their job isn't making the world better, but and that should be a personal choice, whatever seems to work for you.
When we get into the second part, when there's more audience engagement, it would be interesting to hear from you how in your careers you might be advancing the SDGs, even if it's not the core part of your job, but if there's ways that you are working on the SDGs in some capacity. My next question focuses on women, because you raised this in your remarks. When women are consulted as part of development conversations and peace process negotiations, research indicates that outcomes are more sustainable. At last month's UNGA, there were only 21 women among the 190 leaders who spoke. In other words, only 1 out of 10 member states sent a woman to represent them in the most important gathering of multilateral diplomacy. You have been a pioneer in New York politics and served as for 3 terms as a state senator. What advice would you have for us as young leaders to foster greater gender equality in elected and appointed roles?
Well, you know, I think, first of all, they're good women and not so good women, but the fact is, I mean, we do need to engage. There needs to be more recognition of the role that women can play in a variety of different roles. I mean, for example, in crises in the world today, it's usually the women and children that you find largely in displaced persons or refugee camps, and who kind of keep things going. It may not be perfect, but they kind of keep things going. I don't mean there aren't guys there. There are guys there. But it's largely the women and children. But then it gets to the point where maybe somebody thinks about peacekeeping, and they bring the guys in who created the war in the first place, and when in fact, at least they ought to engage some of the women who've been involved in this situation. I remember meeting with some women once in Somalia, and they were each from different tribes, and they didn't like each other. But they said they really wanted the men to stop with the conflict because they wanted their kids to go to school. They didn't say they were all going to be big best friends because they came from different tribes. So, I mean, you know, again, I think supporting programs that help to get all kids into school, all kids into school. I would argue that the gap is still more with, around the world, more with girls not being in school. We've made some big strides in primary school over the last few years, but then COVID hit and boom, kids were out of school and then getting them back in, many of the girls particularly, not only, but many of the girls, early marriage, child marriage, you know, the girls are the ones that go off and get the water. So I think I start with education. To me, first and foremost, all kids getting a decent education, and globally, not limited to primary education. I think it's crucial to get them into secondary education. We know there's a return on every kid being in school, and particularly in girls, getting at least a primary, but secondary education, so important. Their families are more likely to be stable. They're not going to be rich, but they're more likely to be stable. They are less likely to lose their children in childbirth because they know more, so it reduces the amount of under 5 mortality rates. They are less likely to be victims of violence. It doesn't mean they won't be, but they are more likely to be able to say no or figure out how to say no. So there's the direct return on investment. So I know there are many things one can do, but in my mind, the #1 thing is all girls and boys around the world in education, at least through primary school. So.
A note on peacekeeping, I think having worked in UN peacekeeping myself, it's the reason there's so many men is the peacekeepers are sent for year rotations, and it's very hard for women in the developing world to be away from their children for a year. So I think if the UN would create hiring mechanisms and more vacation opportunities for women who do serve as peacekeepers, it would be better, because women actually do want to serve as peacekeepers. They just actually can't leave their families for that long a duration. And you're right. I mean, women in, at least in my experience in South Sudan, they want to be protected by other women. They feel safer with other women. And they have better outcomes, actually. I've done focus group discussions with women, and they love having women peacekeepers. But there's so few of them.
I'm going to just add, it isn't limited to peacekeepers. I'll tell you as a manager, you know, at UNICEF we have wonderful male representatives and wonderful female representatives, but it was harder to convince a younger female to take a position in a non-duty station because it's not that the father didn't love his children, but he would be willing to take a position in a non-family duty station, where a young woman who had children was less likely and wouldn't take it, even though she might be equally as qualified to take a position in a non-family duty station because she didn't want to be. So it actually held back some of the really good, now I'm not talking about peacekeeping, I'm just talking about generally in development, generally across the board, it held some of them back. For a totally understandable reason. It's, you know, one shouldn't be judgmental, but it did hold them back.
No, when I was working for UNDP in South Sudan, I was one of 20% of the staff as women, and that's the UN development program, to your point. So it's not just in peacekeeping, it's in other UN agencies. Given we gather today as young leaders, I'm curious, how might your young leader experience, especially as part of the very first class of this program, have impacted your journey?
I can remember only a couple things. First of all, I couldn't remember who was in my group, but I remembered it seemed like a really good group. I don't know how I got into the group, but I got into it. And then last year when we had the 40th reunion, they put out a list again of who was in the group. And, you know, there was this, I remember there was this tall guy in my group from Missouri. His name was Bill Bradley. I couldn't remember. And then when there was this woman who I had never met before. Her name was Hillary something or other, and I didn't remember any of these, but I remembered it was a real. And then there was this guy who was in the Army, Wesley Clark. But if any of you attended the 40th, it was interesting because there was a discussion about the early groups, and it turned out that those who were in the who were the French coming from France representatives were all like highly recognized and highly respected, and they were saying that the early American groups were just really a crapshoot. They had no idea. So all of you have come later. I'm telling you, since I've been at least in the last few years on part of the selection committee. I mean, it is just bizarro trying to figure out, because you're also incredibly. I mean, you're also impressive, but apparently we were totally a crapshoot in the beginning. But I did bring back one thing from my trip, which had nothing to do with France or the U.S., but I was just impressed with, I was president of the city council at that point, and I was also sitting on the MTA board, Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which runs the subways and the trains. I was actually not by virtue of being council president, but I'd been appointed by the governor. And I was impressed with the signage in France, in the system. Well, you know, I know you, if you've been on the subway system now, we have like better signage. But for years, we didn't. And the one thing I brought back was this thing called a guide-a-ride, that was at bus stops. If anybody remembers that box at bus stops that could at least show you where to go. Anyway, I'd like to say that thank you, young leaders. Help bring the guide a ride.
As a bus rider, thank you. It's
Right,
the boxes at every pole that have the bus schedule. Brilliant. Thanks.
I mean,
Thank you,
it was a great experience, but I also brought that back.
I will not look at that ever the same again. Thank you. I think this is a good opportunity to shift to all of you. Anyone have any questions? Great, Fatima.
But there's another one here, so you can use.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Megan. I would like to come back to the first part of the discussion. That was the international organization and what actually the P5 are doing. What are you thinking, Carol, about the BRICS and the way they are moving by expanding actually the group?
Expanding the Security Council?
No, the BRICS.
Oh, the BRICS. Oh, I'm sorry, the BRICS. That's right. You said the BRICS. Well, you know, I think it's fine. I mean, I think, I think the more that people talk to each other, and frankly, the more people that listen to each other, I think you have to actually start with listening to each other, which would probably be a lot better than talking to each other. But I think, I mean, I don't think the alliances should be created to fight with each other, but I think better if people, if nations and leaders can work together, I think that's a good thing. So I'm not troubled at all by the expansion of the BRICS. I think it's probably not a bad idea at all.
Thanks so much to you both for that discussion. My name is Shannon Walker. I'm part of the 2023 class, and my background is within medicine. My question is regarding the underlying motivation behind the UN and the organizations that fund the UN. I hear a lot of talk in the business sector about finding your why, and if as a leader you can find your employees' why or the reason why people are there and show up each day, you can use that to increase the productivity of your business to secure your goals. And so I'm wondering in this day and age what you would say is the underlying motivation of the UN and its parts and its funders. Is it just altruism? Is it interest in individual nations and their security? What is that why, and how do you think we can strategically use that to actually meet these goals that we're seeking?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I don't think there's a single one. Remember, I don't want to. I'm going to divide the UN a little bit, but I shouldn't really divide it. But it kind of has its international organizations, funds, and programs, and then it has its political side. Not that these aren't sometimes political, but everything from the ones I mentioned, the refugee, the children's, the world food, the migration, even the international financial institutions. Those funders are largely governments. The governments are funding. I mean, most of the funding of the UN is government funded. I mean, it is your boards of directors are representatives from governments. I think the people that work for most of those organizations are, for the most part, motivated by the mission of the organization. You have to be. I mean, nothing drives me crazier than do-gooders who think they can do good with no money. But I think most of them. I mean, you're going to find at a UNICEF, you're going to find folks who have a background in nutrition and health and education, and it's going to be similar. I mean, WHO isn't just doctors. You've got a bunch of lawyers over there. I don't want to make that a bad thing, but I must say, since we're a Debevoise, I brought my cravat bag just to be for the lawyers in the crowd. Sorry. So on balance, I don't mean everyone is like, I mean, you know, there are many, if I can get a job, that's a good thing, or I'm interested in international. But I think that's a good question, because I think one of the challenges today, and I've said it a couple times, is we've kind of lost a global consensus. Not that everybody has to agree on absolutely everything, but the kind of cultural divisions that we see in this country are not in exactly the same way, are very much infecting the world, and maybe part of the cultural divisions in the world are infecting this country as well. So I think it's harder to find out what the why is these days. I do still think, on balance, if one looked at the majority of the 190, what are we, 193 now? The majority of 193 countries, I would think that still the overall why would be that there is a need for some place where the global community can meet and work through and discuss issues. But I think there's been a tear in that, and not just in the last year or so. I think it's been coming. So I think it's harder to answer that part than it is on some of the kind of mission-focused type of elements where I do think there's more of a why, which is I care about these issues.
Carol, can I just add something else?
Sorry.
No.
Sorry. Oh,
Thanks. No,
I thought you had to.
I don't know if this one's working,
All right.
but just to add to that, I think it's important to reflect on the origin story of the UN. I mean, it's based in peace and security. It was after World War II. The idea was to never have another world war. And that's why the Ukraine crisis really presents yet another identity crisis for the UN, because it's like, if Ukraine is happening, what's the point of having the United Nations, right? And that's actually probably one of the reasons the P5 leadership didn't show up this year. But to go back to the origins, it really was about maintaining peace and security in a world order, but that world order has shifted significantly now. And it goes to Carol's point, the P5 represents a reality of 70 plus years ago. It's a relic, and it's a relic that is so hard to disentangle from, because the P5 don't want to give up leadership. They have veto power. So that power dynamic, we'll see if it ever changes. I hope it will. I mean, to me, it's very interesting that only President Biden of the five countries showed up this year. Particularly at a time where it's a midpoint of the 2030 agenda. It's a big year for the UN, and to have President Biden show up and have everyone else be noticeably absent, it's not a good look, but at the same time, it creates space for other voices, particularly from the global south.
I'm sorry, I don't want to drag this down. But I also want to, since we've talked about these global goals, one of the big changes from the other global goals called the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals was a recognition that you're not going to achieve the eradication of poverty or getting children in school without there being peace and security. Peace and security was actually not part of the, I mean, not that they were against peace and security, but it wasn't part of the earlier kind of global consensus around these global goals, whereas peace and security is, or the need for reduce conflict and more peace. So
Yeah,
sorry to drag that out.
No, I mean, another thought on that too is, if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, the architect of those was Jeffrey Sachs, an economist at Columbia. He really was the mastermind, for lack of a better word. And if you look at the Millennium Development Goals to the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, it was an incredibly comprehensive process. It was years of consultation. They had over 300 proposed goals initially. They whittled it down to 17, which is still a lot. But that itself was a Herculean talent, like a Herculean feat, and I think it was nothing short of an international triumph to get 17 goals. The international community to agree to 17 goals in 2015, and that's why we're at the halfway point now. But as Carol said, we're halfway, and we are so behind. And it will take an international lift and a collective lift to make them happen.
Thank you. Also, a Girl Scout member.
Yes.
Hi, Omar Woodard, 2022 Young Leader. To go back to the initial question of the initial focus on the agenda being long-term reform for the UN. So hearing after this last question, your response, it seems as though that the P5 structure is based on immediate post-World War II. The international financial institutions are based on immediate post-Bretton Woods, right? And so everything is an antiquated system, version, and structure. And so wouldn't it be true that as a result, we will not likely achieve greater peace and security because of that antiquated structure. And so it would be better, rather than to focus on SDG goals that the structure will preclude us from reaching, to focus on fundamental reform of the UN and its structures primarily.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, in fact, that was the initial focus of this year, as I said. That was supposed to be the focus, and then and then they wanted to go back to, not go back to the SDGs, but the focus was the future. And I mean, the problem is we've been talking about reform of the UN for so long, and nothing happens in reform of the UN, nothing happens in reform of the UN, and the only part that they can ever reform are about 3 or 4 different agencies, of which UNICEF was one of them. But yes, yeah, it does. I think in the long run, really taking a look at some of the structures, or the international structures, has to be accomplished before we are going to really achieve these goals. It doesn't mean that we should put the goals aside and not be working on them, because at a minimum, you know, heads of state did sign off to these, so there could be some global pressure to it. But yes, some of the changes have to come, because we're just not going to get there without it.
Agreed.
Do we still have time for another question?
I think it's on, or whatever, or just yell.
So I have a question about kind of, you know, so Cindy Carcamo, I'm a young leader from 2012. And, 2013, sorry. And I'm also a staff writer at the LA Times. And for a long time, I reported on immigration issues. And I'm wondering if you can answer this question about kind of like the disconnect between the American public and the United Nations, and what the United Nations does, its relevance, its importance in society. I've spoken with a lot of, for instance, anti-illegal immigration folks out there who are very much opposed to what the UN does. They see it as this kind of like world order that's kind of governing our lives and is out of touch with the normal, just day-to-day person. And so I'm wondering, how do you kind of bring these people to the fold? We're so polarized, right? We're in a time where people don't even believe climate change is real. I mean, a good portion of American society. So I mean, how do you kind of bring these people to the fold? I understand we're talking about reform, we're talking about all these really big goals, but when we don't even have consensus when it comes to whether we're killing our planet, I mean, you know, which leads into immigration, it leads to a whole other issues. Like, how do you kind of connect with these normal day-to-day people? Do you think that's important?
Well, yes, I think it's important, but remember, I mean, you know, the polls have shown, and I forget what the number is now, so this is not going to be the correct number, but polls have shown that Americans think that something like 25% of the U.S. budget goes into foreign affairs, not just the UN, when it's like a minuscule portion. And so, you know, I don't think we're going to win the battle by saying you should love the UN. So that's why I think I come back to, you know, achieving, whether we call them the SDGs or others, but achieving some of these goals, which is reducing the number of children that die before the age of 5, improving maternal mortality. Maternal mortality is a crisis in this country. In this country. Child poverty just doubled in this country. I mean, if we can get some agreement internationally on some of the environment issues. So I don't think, as much as I would like to run out and say you should love the UN, I don't think I'm going to make that. I'm not going to win with that argument. I'm going to win more. I'm going to slightly move the, you know, the opinion maybe more about talking about some of the substantive issues of poverty, children, environment, health, and some of those. Otherwise, I think that's the only way it's going to happen. Now, the good news is, I don't know whether we have any more. I don't think there's a global consensus in this country either at this point. So, but you know, the UN isn't going to go away, at least for the time being. It's here. There are some things of it should go away, frankly. There are a couple. You know, the only thing harder than starting something at the UN is stopping it. So there probably are a couple pieces that should go away. But I think it is the substantive issues that have the potential for success in convincing people rather than telling them they should love the UN. One final thing, because I know time is out. Yeah. Actually, when I was head of UNICEF, a friend of mine, Catherine Bertini, was head of the World Food Program. And as you know, there are certain governments that have certain positions. Whether they should have them or not is another question. But historically, the U.S. has had, it used to have 4, but historically it has had 3 of the Undersecretary General positions. And Catherine and I used to try and keep it quiet that 2 of the Undersecretary General positions were held by New Yorkers, because that would have convinced everybody that, in fact, there are black helicopters, frankly, if New Yorkers were running the UN at this point. So we never let them know that. The good news is she's the upstate Republican, I'm the downstate Democrat. Well, she's the upstate Rockefeller Republican. You're all too young to know what a Rockefeller Republican is, but it's a good thing.
Can I have one thought on that? Are we okay for time for a few more minutes? Or, no, yeah. Wait, I'll just say one more thing. On the SDGs, I think the American public needs to be educated. In this room of young leaders, I don't think everyone actually knew what the Sustainable Development Goals are. And my 8-year-old nephew in Portugal knows, because they teach it in the schools there. And I spoke to a group of Japanese school children 2 weeks ago that also learn about the SDGs in schools. So at a young age, they're learning about the relevance about the SDGs in their lives. So I think the American public needs to be better educated about them. And one other point on that, when I worked for Samantha Power, when she was the US ambassador to the UN, she's now the head of USAID, part of her mission was to go to small towns in America and literally city halls or town halls and talk about the SDGs, to try to talk to normal Americans about the relevance of the SDGs in their lives.
The U.S. Fund for UNICEF does that too. But I agree, totally.
Yeah, it's educating. Okay,
thank you all again.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol.
Yeah, sorry, thank you.